If you're on an average income with an average house and an average mortgage, is it still actually possible to invest in property in New Zealand today? Now, this is a question I get every single week because while Kiwis want to get ahead, when the average house costs almost $800,000, you might wonder, well, how do people actually invest in property and get ahead? It feels impossible. And let's be honest, a lot of people do feel like property investing is only for the rich these days. But last year, my team at Opus Partners helped over 530 everyday Kiwis grow their property portfolio. And between Andrew, my co-host, and I, we own just under 50 properties, even though we didn't grow up with really, really rich parents. So in this video, you're going to learn what the average Kiwi investor looks like today in 2025, and if that average Kiwi could still invest in property. I'm Ed, an economist and property investor, and this is the Property Academy podcast. Now, Andrew, money-wise, what does the average Kiwi look like?
Now, I know, because there's going to be a whole lot of people listening to this that go, oh, that's not the numbers for me. Just remember, averages are the mid-range, and then you've got people, there's 50% of people that are going to have bigger mortgages, and 50% they'll have less mortgages. But the median house price in New Zealand at the moment is $781,000.
So that's what the average house sells for?
Yep. Now, the average household income for two household earners is $135,000. It's quite high, isn't it?
Yeah, so that'd be, what, 67.5 grand each?
Yep.
Would be if it's two people, or it could be one person earning 135 grand.
Yeah, and then your average owner-occupier mortgage is $320,000, so that's probably less than what some people might expect.
320 grand for the average mortgage. What do you reckon? That seems quite low, eh?
Yeah, but you've also got to remember, it does feel low, but then you think about all those people that bought, 20 years ago and they've been diligently paying down their mortgage, and maybe they had another property, or maybe they had some other money come in and they've been able to pay down their mortgage over a long period of time.
Well, to be honest, if you bought 20 years ago, your mortgage is probably much lower than 320 grand. The mistake that people sometimes make when they're thinking about the average Kiwi is they think, cool, the average house is 781 grand, you need a 20% deposit, and so the average mortgage has a 6 in front of it. That's not actually the case.
Because the average new mortgage maybe.
That's what it would be if you were borrowing that amount. But if we look at what is the average mortgage of people who have mortgages, it's actually much lower, 320 grand. So and in fact, the average Kiwi is ahead on their mortgages, according to Westpac's data.
Interesting. And so your average mortgage makes up about 40% of the average house price. So we've got an average DTI, debt to income ratio, of 2.4 times.
And these are, of course, all ballpark figures. Because I always say about averages is half of you will have, as you said before, an above average mortgage, and half of you will have a below average mortgage. But this is the average Kiwi. The other thing that's important when we're talking about can the average Kiwi afford to become a property investor, we really here are talking about the average homeowner, right? Because not every Kiwi owns property, but we're talking about assuming that you have the average mortgage and the average ballpark house value, could you afford to buy a property? And that assumes you are a homeowner. Not everybody is a homeowner. But I think what most people get wrong when they think about investing in property is they think you've got to have $100,000 or $150,000 worth of cash that you can then go take and buy that investment property. Basically, you save up your deposit to buy your first home, then you've got to save up another cash deposit to go and buy your first investment property. And that's not often how it works, almost never how it works. What happens in practice, Andrew?
I know when I bought my first investment property, I saved my deposit, but that is the long way of doing it. And I only did that because I didn't already have a house myself. For most investors, if you've got equity in your house, borrow against that. You borrow your deposit against your house, and then you go buy a rental property using that cash as your deposit.
And I know we've done a couple of videos on this. I recorded one recently about I found a cheaper way to invest, and we'll link that down in the description so everybody can watch that. But let's walk through those average numbers to see what it looks like. So the average house value or average house price at the moment is $781,000 in total. And what did we say the average mortgage was?
$320,000.
And so you can borrow up to 80% against the value of your home. And that means that the average homeowner in New Zealand, if these were your numbers, you'd have about 305 grand worth of usable equity. Now, what does that mean in practice, Andrew? What can somebody do with that money?
So you could take that money out, subject to the bank actually approving it. You could take that money out and you could invest in anything, really. You could go and put that money in the share market if you wanted. You could go and buy yourself a pony. You could buy yourself a really fancy car. Or you can turn that into your deposit for an investment property. And if you want to know what that converts to, somewhere between $850,000 or up to $1.5 million, depending on if you're buying a new property or an existing property, because existing properties require more deposit.
And when we're talking about taking the money out, which you said, what we really mean is borrowing the deposit against your own home so you're able to go and buy that investment property. And if you've got a $300,000 deposit, well, that's actually quite a lot of money to invest.
It's a lot, but don't get too excited, because if you're going at that upper end of that range, that $1.5 million, your average Kiwi on these kind of incomes that we're talking about before, they've got the equity to do it, but they're not going to be able to pass the bank's servicing test. The bank's not going to just give them that money if they can't afford it.
Yeah, that's because you've also got to pass the income criteria. And if we're thinking about the income criteria and the debt to income ratios and all of these rules about can you afford a mortgage or not, a lot of that is very, very complicated, which is actually the exact reason why I built you guys a calculator. And if you answer just 8 questions, this calculator will give you a number about what you could potentially be able to invest. I really emphasize potentially because it's very, very ballpark, but it will give you a sense. So let's say that you do have a partner, and how many kids would the average Kiwi have?
2.
About 2 kids. This is important, obviously, because if you've got 6 kids' mouths to feed, then the bank's going to say, well, you've got a lot of expenses. So 2 kids, how many cars would the average Kiwi have?
I'd say 1 is my guess.
Okay, so 2 kids, 1 car, and we set that together, they earn 135 grand.
So put one person on 100 and one on 35.
Yeah, okay. So one person is on earning 100K, the other person's earning 35 grand. So that would be somebody who's like working part-time, maybe if they're looking after those kids. And let's say they don't have any savings, because we recently did a podcast that showed that the average Kiwi is saving negative 2% of their income. But the value of their home, we said $781,000, because that's what the average house sells for. 320 grand is the average mortgage. And let's say that they are living in that. So once we look at both the equity side and the income side, this person might be able to spend this couple might be able to spend 565 grand on that investment property. Based on those numbers, does that sound realistic, given that you used to be a mortgage advisor?
That feels pretty realistic. It's nowhere near the $1.5 million that they could have bought as a maximum based on their equity, but based on income and based on the fact that they've got a couple of kids and one full-time income, one part-time income, yeah, that probably makes sense right now.
And then what you can also see this calculator is based on these numbers, they might be able to buy something in a more affordable place, like something in Christchurch or Invercargill. So if you want to try that out for yourself, you're going to be able to get an answer in like 2 minutes about whether it's your first or your next investment property. I'll link that down in the description just so you can play around with that. And I think that what I would just say is if you already own, I think, 4 investment properties, I think we max out this quiz. You really need to then start talking to a mortgage broker, because it depends how you've set it up.
And actually, to be fair, like this is just a ballpark anyway. If you want to get a really robust number, then you probably should have a conversation with a bank or a mortgage broker. We recommend a mortgage broker who have got more options than just going to a bank directly, because you want to make sure that if there's some complexities to your situation, or if there are some ways that they can improve your ability or your number to go out and spend on an investment property, if that's what you want to do, then absolutely you want to know what those things are. And I think the key message here is that actually just property investment is not just for the rich 1%, not for the rich guys. It's just for the normal mum and dad investors. And
it's quite funny you say that, because we obviously put out a lot of posts on Instagram and TikTok. right? Talking about property investing and trying to make it accessible for everyday people. And we sometimes get comments where people say, can you adjust your filters so you're just targeting the 1%, please? Because this isn't going to be possible for me. Now, number one, you can't actually do that on Instagram. But I suppose actually the message we're trying to get across is it's not for the 1%. I mean, how many people actually invest in property in New Zealand?
Well, so the FMA actually did a study on this, and it worked out to be actually 10%. 1 in 10 people are property investors. That's actually more than I would have expected.
Well, it goes up and down. I mean, if we looked back in 2019, I think it was up to 14%. The next year, it's 9%. The year after that, it was 11%. I mean, the actual number wouldn't jump around as much as the FMA's numbers do, but that's just because they're doing a survey, and each year you're surveying slightly different people. But somewhere between 9 and 14% of Kiwis actually do invest in property. So it's not necessarily just for the top 1%. I wouldn't even say it's just for the top 10%. Because it's not that necessarily, just the top 10% of people are investing. It might be that some people who are really rich might not invest in property at all. They might own things like shares or whatever. But at least 1 in 10 Kiwis are investing in property.
It's funny when you look at these numbers and you look at the term deposits, about a third of people in term deposits. So whilst we always make the song and dance, property investment's the way that people make money in New Zealand, and that's kind of the only thing that people invest in. That's not true. Shares kind of hover around that 20%, and term deposits are 30%.
Well, the thing about that is term deposits and shares both have lower barriers to entry.
Yeah.
Like with a house, you need to have a bit of deposits to go and buy one. But if you are a retiree, even if you've saved up 10 grand, you can invest in term deposits.
Yeah, that's
and
true.
so they can be very accessible. There'll be an age and stage. The interesting thing is, if we think about KiwiSaver, according to the FMA survey results, only 64% of people are in KiwiSaver. So if I got you to think about, and just picture this in your mind's eye, in your head, right?
Yep.
Picture all of the people in New Zealand who you think are signed up for KiwiSaver. Have you got that?
Hang on. What am I picturing?
You're picturing
I'm
all
imagining all the people that I imagine are in KiwiSaver.
All of the people in New Zealand
got it.
who are investing in KiwiSaver. How many people are we talking?
Well, 64% of 5 million.
So a lot of people.
3
right?
mil.
Right? So 3 million people, right?
Yeah.
Now, 1 in 6 of those people take a step forward. That's the number of property investors in New Zealand.
Okay.
Oh,
yeah, okay.
You like that now?
I like where you went with that.
Yeah. I'm trying to get across that a lot of people invest in property in New Zealand. And when you say, 10% of the people surveyed, that doesn't sound like that much.
Yeah.
Well, if you think, only just under 2/3 of people are in KiwiSaver, so a sixth of the people who invest in KiwiSaver are investing in property, you start to say, actually, that is a very large number of people. So maybe the average Kiwi might not choose to invest in property, but based on these numbers, the average homeowner could potentially invest in property. And it's made me think of a couple of property investors who are both average and then also below average in terms of income, who are actually making it work. I know there was one couple, we like to call them the Pak'n Save property investors.
Well, you do. We had them on a webinar a couple of years ago, probably now, Adam and Maddie. They are both in their early 20s. They work at Pak'n Save. Adam was 25, Maddie's 23, and they started property investing and just by grinding hard, like saving their deposit for their first home. They did that a couple of years ago. Then they added value to that property, carried on saving. Then they bought their first investment property. These are guys where they're just earning very regular incomes, but are being irregular in the amount of hustle that they're doing to get ahead.
Yeah, and they're choosing to do things like renovate their home to increase its value so they can borrow more against it, and going in and asking their boss, what do I need to do in order to get a pay rise so I can afford that investment property? But it also reminds me, there was a really inspirational podcast we did. We met a lady called Te Ahuru, who was a podcast listener and YouTube watcher. And after reading our book, Wealth Plan, she ended up getting so inspired, she bought her house off her parents, the one that she was living in, and ended up starting to invest in property. And another teacher, actually, a lot of teachers investing in property, Becky, who came on the show and was talking about, even though she's a single mum, decided to invest in property to secure her own financial future. And so these are people on very normal incomes who are still making it work or choosing to make it work. Again, it's not that the average Kiwi will invest in property, but do they have the ability to? Well, if you own your own home, then potentially you can.
And I think probably the key message actually is don't count yourself out. Like when I think about Adam and Maddie, for example, like they've got every reason to say, no, we don't have the incomes or we don't have the equity on our side yet. We're just going to figure it all out later on. No, they decided we're going to work hard and actually get ahead. And for a lot of you listening to the show, you're probably not on the average income. You're probably on better than the average income, and you've probably not got the average amount of equity in your house. You've probably got more than that, particularly if you are a little bit older and you've owned your house for a while. So what you need to do is actually use the calculator to find out, well, what is possible for me, and or talk to a mortgage broker and really dig into those numbers.
So if you've run the numbers and it looks like you can invest, well, that's just the first step of Bidi Bidi, because now you need to turn that knowledge that you've got into some actual long-term wealth. So check out this next video where I walk you through the exact blueprint to retire rich by 55, even if you're starting late.